Hey, how's it going? My name is Luke, and I'm an instructor here at Covalence. I'm a product of this bootcamp as well, aka I'm an alumni. I graduated, I think, like 2018 or so. So I've been coding JavaScript, TypeScript since then. I did some freelance work and eventually wound up teaching back here at Covalence, and I absolutely love it here. Now I get to be making YouTube videos and doing content creation, making my own courses. So if you want to learn about some advanced React stuff, I have an entire React course available in Covalence. Check the description and comments below. Make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and welcome to this playlist series. This is going to be a more long-form playlist where I'm going to attempt to build a DnD note-taking app from total scratch. We're going to build a full-stack application starting with a blank folder and working all the way up to deploying it into production. I don't think it's going to have a ton of incredibly fancy features. This is more of taking, for example, like I'm making this with the idea in mind of my fresh alumni from our full stack camp to help guide them along their journey. They'll know how they can build an app like this, and I figure I'll give them some insight into some things they can take into consideration, maybe some patterns that they haven't quite thought of yet, or some cool tricks they may not have figured out along their path. This is also great for y'all coming organically through YouTube or subreddits or wherever you might find this link to this playlist. But the point is here, I want to take y'all through these fundamentals that I teach day in and day out, and just especially if you have like no server or database knowledge, this is going to be fairly good and fundamental for you to pick up as well. And I'll show you how like a full stack application can be built, works, and deployed, and we'll get it featured and put out there. And if there's any like cool discussions, either from our Discord community or through YouTube comments and things like that, or even not merge. I mean, I'm probably going to cause a merge conflict, let's be real. But if there's like a cool pull request from y'all out there watching this video and you think a cool feature could be added into the series, maybe we can collaborate together and do like a little video of how we're going to code and add a feature you have an idea for. But yeah, this is going to be kind of free-flowing, long-form tutorial that's going to take us from nothing to, again, a full stack CRUD application and whatever that may entail along the way. So, I probably should be screen sharing over here. So what's the dealio? Like I said, we're going to be using a MERN stack. In the case of M instead of MongoDB, we're going to be using MySQL, 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 whatever you want to call it. I like MySQL and SQL languages. I'm a Postgres fan myself as well. I love using it for my projects. We're going to be using MySQL here because, again, that's what a lot of my alumni are going to know and be experienced with. We're going to use Express and React and probably not touch React Native. So technically, it's more like a MER stack. The point is going to be a full stack CRUD application: create, read, update, destroy. The basics of a D&D note-taking app. You're going to have to be editing your notes, maybe deleting ones that are no longer relevant or mistakes or something like that, reading them so you can display them on our web page here, and creating them so we can add new notes. It's going to be mono repo. A lot of the times when I build my projects, I tend to build them like a headless CMS almost. Like I build a server and deploy it somewhere with the API routes, and it's its own repo and its own deployment. And then I pick something like Create React App, Next.js, Remix.js is really popular. I built a few things in Vue recently. And I deploy those elsewhere, typically Vercel, and I maintain a repo for the client website from there. So that's how I normally build things. That's going to be difficult to do a lot of jumping around in a video format like this. So I'm going to be taking the approach of building both the client and the server side code from one mono repo, and we're going to have to do some shenanigans, some chicanery, if you will, in our package JSON and our scripts to get that working the way that is, along with webpack and all that kind of fun stuff. So yeah. And again, the idea is a D&D note-taking app. And it's not, we're going to start with some basic features and then I'll kind of wing it from there. What you should know, this is all kind of up in the air. Like, I don't think this is going to be great for a complete, total newbie beginner that has no idea what even a variable is. I'm assuming you've done maybe some free code camp stuff. Maybe you have followed some other YouTube tutorials because there's so many good ones here. Maybe you even bought like a Udemy course or two and began picking up some of the fundamentals. I'll be taking us through, I'm not going to be explaining every little thing in painstaking detail. I'll be making some assumptions of what you know along the way already, so keep that in mind. But if you know a little bit about shell scripting, like if you've done any coding work, you probably are already familiar with your terminals. Whether that's going to be just your built-in terminal on your Mac OS, which these days is Z Shell, but if you have an old OS, it'll be Bash. Either way, it's going to be fine. If you're on Windows, I have personal experience with Commander. I'll be going over that in a minute. But if you have if you're on Windows and you already know how to do some shell scripting, you should be good to go with whatever you feel comfortable with. It's not going to be super advanced, so don't super worry about that. Fundamentals of JavaScript, like I was saying in the previous slide, you should know probably a little bit about coding to follow this tutorial. Again, I'm not going to be going over what is a variable or what is a component in React, so having even like basic knowledge of these things, or even having the docs open as I go through them, or again, drop comments below. Maybe I can make other one-off series to help y'all. We'll be covering the basics of Node and Express, and again, the basics is MySQL, but don't fret if you have like zero SQL knowledge and you feel like you won't be able to keep up. We're not going to be doing anything super crazy advanced, and I'll go over the statements and why I write them the way I do. And maybe I'll even do a database dump, or even like keep a DB like file, like a text file in this repository. So if you don't have any intention of learning SQL, at least you can get the create tables and insert statements and things like that for all the fun stuff we're going to do. Yeah, I mean, so as long as you have if you've done like a couple, like I said, Udemy courses, or followed some other tutorials that built similar styled apps to this. Like I have done many of them since I graduated Covalence. I love going through different kinds of courses and things to see how different people write their code, approach certain patterns and things like that. I think it's fantastic. Just get out there, build, and the more you build, the better you get, the more you learn, right? And what we're going to use to achieve all this, we're going to be doing JavaScript, obviously. In particular, I'll be using TypeScript, but again, don't fret if you have no clue what that is. I'll go over it. And in the way I use TypeScript, we're not going to be doing I always tell my students it's like a dial or like a spectrum of TypeScript, because a lot of them, they get very overwhelmed or scared of TypeScript when it's actually not that bad. It's here to help us. And again, at the end of the day, we can just put any as a type everywhere we want, and is basically akin to writing just vanilla JavaScript. I'll use TypeScript with a dial, and I'll dial it up over time, so I'm not going to be cranking the dial all the way for pure 100% type safety, which if we're writing a large group collaborative project, I'd probably recommend you do. I'll instead be using it somewhere in the middle, more like an IntelliSense booster, an autocomplete helper, and a don't make dumb mistakes and typos helper, rather than a full 100% type safety. And we'll ratchet it up over time. Obviously, we're going to be using a React as our client-side JavaScript code. We're going to be using Node for our server-side code, and rather than writing an entire REST API in just vanilla Node code, which is doable, but a pain in the tuchus, if you know what I mean. We'll be using Express, a very popular library installed via NPM for Node. We'll be using MySQL for the database. We'll be using Webpack to bundle and compile all this together. The vomit emoji is there because I don't have a good relationship with Webpack, and I don't like that it's an industry standard, because it's a convoluted mess, in my opinion. And I feel like every time I dive into learning more about Webpack, I come out knowing less. So I'll cover what I need to cover for Webpack, and we'll hopefully just get it coded out and move on. We'll be using Node Package Manager, obviously, that comes installed with Node when you install it. That's redundant. It comes installed with Node when you install Node. There we go. And then we'll be using Git to push our code to GitHub as well. We're going to be using, in my case, I'll be using Commander as my terminal. So if you're on Mac, you can just use your built-in terminal. If you're on Windows, you can use whatever shell you have a preference for. And if you don't know what you're doing, then go to Commander's site, download its zip file, unzip the Commander executable to somewhere on your hard drive. I chose at the root of my computer to make it easy to CD, change directories around. And it's a great little emulator for like a bash style shell on a Windows machine. But I know there's like WSL2 and some other options as well. So just pick one that you like and go for it. I'll be using Commander on my machine. I'll be using VS Code as my code editor. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what you do. If you have a full-fledged IDE, go for it. Maybe you're a fan of Sublime. I don't care. But if you want to follow along with me, I'll be using VS Code. Postman is another piece of software I'll be using. Software, more like another Chromium browser. Headless Chromium app. I'll be using Postman, but there are some other options, like there's our in-browser server route testing elements. So I'll be using Postman to test the routes on my Node Express server before I begin to go code the React component that might be making that request to get some information and display it. I will be using MySQL Server and Workbench to build out the database portion of this. So you can just go and look up the MySQL Server Workbench like community installer and just install whatever version of MySQL Server and its associated version of Workbench, right? But if you have a preference to a different kind of graphical user interface instead of Workbench, please go for it if you have some SQL background. Or again, get in the comments, let me know what you prefer, because I like looking at new options and exploring things and finding and learning cool new things, which is why I love teaching so much, because I get to learn as much from y'all and your comments and discussions as much as you can learn from me. I just realized I have Postman here twice, so clearly we're going to replace this one with professionalism, where I don't make dumb typos and write things out twice in a row. I no redundancies here on my end. I don't know what you're talking about. I'll be using Heroku to eventually deploy this here. Now, unfortunately, Heroku is losing free tier deployment, so I'll actually be paying the $7 a month for a hobby tier to get this deployed. That's how committed I am to you, a whole $7 a month. I'll be, just because I like its deployment process, and we do get to talk about some deployment concepts without having to go in the nitty gritty. If we didn't have a platform as a service such as Heroku, right? It does abstract some low-level architecture out of our way for deployment, and it gives us some topics to discuss, so I'll be using it there. And obviously, I'll be housing all this code on GitHub, and I will do my best to keep maybe like a README of our changelog and commits and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically everything y'all need to know to get started here, and I'm itching to get dug on in. So without further ado, thanks for sticking with me through that intro. Maybe I'll even put a time code here for those that aren't interested to go ahead and get started. I have a clean Chrome tab. I probably should include that in how things we're going to use. Maybe that's what I meant instead of Postman twice. I meant to write Chrome, because I'll be using Chrome as my development browser of choice, where I'll have my console window here. We'll be using a lot. So yeah, let's dive on in. I have my commander, my shell, open here in a directory I'll be building this entire project in, and I've been using boilerplates for such a long time that I haven't actually written one of these out from, well, complete scratch in quite some time, so this might be interesting. I mean, I have done like some practice runs and made sure to look up certain aspects of webpack so I can define the properties of an object, for example, at least at a basic level. But yeah, I'm pretty excited, because going from an empty directory to a full stack application, that's going to be some cool skill sets we're going to build here together. So here we go. Let's make a new directory. We'll call it DnD Note Taker. Beautiful name, I know. Again, I'll be happy to change it if there's any cool discussions or comments or ideas that y'all send me. I'm open to all things. We're going to change directory into that particular one, and this is it. This is where we're going to begin to build out the whole thing. So structure-wise, we're going to need to have Node installed so we can begin installing packages such as React and things like that. So obviously, I need to go ahead and build out my package JSON. We can do that with npm init-y. The -y just answers yes to all the questions that fill out this. Either we'll fill it out together, or I'll fill it out like between videos and just put in the README that I updated it. But again, this is something you get to fill out as well, however you want, with like your name, description, and things like that. Not that big of a deal for the project itself. Okay, so now that we have that ready to go, we are going to need to have a couple things. Well, first off, this is going to be a full stack application with both a client and server running at the same time. The client's going to be obviously will be our Chrome browsers, which means we're going to need at the very least an index HTML. We're going to be building this as a single page application with React. Basically what Create React App does, we're going to have our code compile and bundle all of our TypeScript and TSX code down to browser-safe JavaScript as a singular app.js bundle. We're going to shove that in the index HTML and load that in the browser and call it a day. I'm not looking to build something insanely robust with like code splitting and all this other crazy stuff that things like Next.js and Create React App come built in with. That's so much like configuring and optimizing that's kind of out of the scope of this series, where we're going to learn how to build an app, and then over time you can transform it and add these features as we go along. So, okay. That means I'll need we're going to call it a public directory, and inside of that public directory, I want to make an index HTML, because that's going to be where we have our app.js file eventually attached to it. That's going to be loading in the browser when time comes. I'll need a source directory that's going to correspond to all of our source code, and then from there, I'm going to cd into source right now, and then make two more directories. We're going to make a client directory, and we're going to make a server directory. Yeah, and then that's our structure. We have that source folder with client for obviously all things React and website or web app, whatever you want to call it, related. And then obviously server will be, well, all things server related. All of our Node and our Express and database connected code will be there. So let's see, what else do we need to have set up for this sucker? We'll probably need a git ignore, so I'll go ahead and make one of those. This file is so we can make sure that we don't push our node modules and our compiled code to GitHub. That way we can keep only our source code there. I will need a readme.md. We need that markdown file so we can have like a nice landing page for our repos. If you want to make this into like a portfolio worthy project, I think it totally would be. We're going to have our README just be like, hey, hello, here's how maybe you can download and run the app. Here's its purpose, what I learned from it. Like, it's a good place to write down like your thoughts of what you learned building this application. So in case recruiters or interviewers take a look at this repository, the README is a nice, like, hey, how's it going? Check this stuff out kind of landing page, if you will. And we'll need to make a tsconfig JSON file because we're going to be using TypeScript and I want to have some custom rules added to it. Asterisk here because I've learned something about tsconfig setups in a monorepo like this that has both client and server, which will have two different configurations for TypeScript because we're, well, writing server-side code versus front-end React code. So we're going to have this tsconfig basically act as like a mother link to two more individual tsconfigs that will be in the client and the server directories in a little bit here. And then last but definitely least, in my opinion, is the webpack config.js. I'm not a fan of this, and we're going to just try and push our way through it, and I'll describe what I'm writing to the best of my ability. Because again, I feel that the more notes I take on it, the less I actually know. But yeah. So now we've gone from, please tell me I didn't make that in source. Okay, no, I made it in, make sure if you just did that in your source directory, notice I did ... That's a shorthand in most shell environments. I think that just see us move up one directory, and I didn't write cd ... I just panicked for a second there thinking I put that in my, that I put that in the source directory and not the root of the project, aka DnD NoteMaker. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and turn this into a Git project as well. So I'm going to initialize an empty Git repository. We're going to get some base level code written out and push that to a GitHub that I'll probably make sure to keep in the description of this video below as well. That way y'all can follow along with my changes in my source code and watch what I do. Okie dokie artichoke. We got all that set up, and I think it's finally high time to start writing some code and writing some stuff out. So yeah, let's rock and roll. Man, this is cool. I'm excited. I'm super excited. This is gonna be a lot of fun. Okie dokie artichoke. My favorite phrase, evidently. In the tsconfig, like I said, this is going to be fairly simple. All I need it to do is tell it to exclude node_modules once we begin combining them here, and we're going to have this one kind of act as like a link that our two individual ones here will basically extend, because we need to have different types on our server compared to our client, and then this is going to kind of act as like the top level that combines them together. Because you know, in our course we typically, like, the other boilerplate that I use has a tsconfig client and a tsconfig server, but the problem is that VS Code can't infer which one it's going to need to use based on what file I have open, and it gives me spotty type support, which I find very annoying. So I figured out this way is actually a cleaner and safer way to do it. So that's why I'm going to have this one kind of be empty and be extended by the other ones we're going to make here and later in this tutorial. Yeah. So other things. We're going to have to build out our git ignore. Let's see. Eventually, we're going to have environment variables. So I'm going to leave a text-based comment here that says we're going to ignore an env file we're going to have in the future. Should I add that now, or should I add that when I actually add this to my project? For now, I'll just say add this for now. It's just a good concept to have right here. For production code, I'm going to have eventually a folder called dist that builds this stuff out, but clearly I'm not going to have that going on right away. Rather, I should be this way. Dist is going to be a folder where our production and compiled code is going to go. I don't want to push that to GitHub. It tends to cause a lot of merge conflicts if you're not careful. So I'm going to say that right there is something where that dist folder we're going to talk about when we talk about the webpack configuration. I don't want to push I want to push non-source code to GitHub, right? There are some cases where your deployment strategy may be compile locally and push compile code to GitHub so they can read that and deploy it. But in our case, we're going to keep just source code there. And then also in that public folder, eventually we're going to have a folder called /JS that has our bundled and compiled React code in it. And again, that's going to be non-source code. That's going to be compiled code. So I don't want to push that to GitHub either. And also the classic, don't forget node modules. So you don't push a massive folder of garbage to GitHub and take up bandwidth, your precious time and bandwidth on your machine when you're trying to push a massive node modules folder to GitHub, right? So yeah, that's going to be a simple starting point here for our git ignore. We may come and add more things to it in the future, but that's always a pretty good starting point right here. Okay, in our package.json, we don't need to talk about our scripts yet because we don't have anything installed, so that makes sense. So maybe we can... well, you know, webpack is going to be bundling all of our code, and we give it a certain set of rules to follow because we have to translate our code from TypeScript to JavaScript and smash it together and tell it how to handle import statements. And if it's server-side code, we have to let it know expressly that, hey, you are server-side JavaScript because you're going to be behaving and having different things. You're going to have different things happening to you than code that would run in the client. So we actually have to make two different configurations for our code here, right? So first things first, I need to eventually be using some pathing because I want to make sure that when I'm telling it how to build and where to output my code, eventually I'm going to have to use the path module of Node, which allows me to make relative paths compared to this directory right here, rather than having to constantly write absolute paths like C, Luke's account, Luke's Covalence folder, helping students. And so I don't want to have to reference absolute paths, and this module will help us get around that. So when I'm telling Webpack where it needs to output the bundled and compiled code, we'll be using path to do that. So that's going to be one thing I'm going to bring in right away. So let's go ahead and start with the client config. So these are going to be some objects. We're going to call it const client config. It's an object. And here we go. Mode, it has different rules for different environments, obviously. And in our case, we're only going to be having two, which is either production or development. We're using a JavaScript short circuit here, this logical OR operator. If the node environment is not provided, which ours probably won't be on our local machines unless you already have your local environment variable set up to include an env, I want it to just default to development and give me like bigger error outputs and things like that when it's following this mode. But when we deploy to Heroku, for example, it sets its own internal node environment as production, which means the string production will be used in place of development in Heroku, which is where our production deployed code is going to be, and it's going to follow a different set of rules when compiling and bundling our code for us. So it's a really convenient thing it has right there. We don't have the entry point written yet, but it's going to be in the source folder, in the client folder, and in particular, the entry point for my entire React application will be in index.tsx. That's where we're going to find our root element and render our entire application, which will be starting at hopefully by the end of the video, just an H1 that says, yo, what up in the browser or something like that. That's what entry is. For the client side stuff, we're going to have a dev tool property that will give us what's called an inline source map. This is going to be, because again, we're writing TypeScript code, which gets compiled down to JavaScript, which gets smashed into a bundle, a singular app.js, probably like in ES5, like more old school, browser friendly and safe JavaScript code to run. And how do we know if an error occurs in one of our components in the browser? How is it going to know how to like kind of reverse engineer the approximate line and the file that error is occurring in? It's like, oh, this is occurring in your header component that is a child render of the nav bar or something like that. Like the inline source map just kind of helps, again, like map our source code to the production, like the running code in the browser, and saying a line saying, hey, if this error happens here, it corresponds to somewhere in that file. That way we have at least a hint of where to go digging for an error when we're looking at our code in the browser, because we've gone through several layers of translated code before we actually get there. So this is a nifty dev tool to help give us some error hints when we get that far, which we're going to make many. I make tons of errors, and I always tell my students, you never get away from making them. You just get better at solving them, right? Because I still make the same dumb typos. Like you saw in the opening slides, I had written Postman twice like an idiot. But it's okay. Like you never get away from making them. You just get better at fixing them and understanding them. So module. This is a set of rules for how we're going to be telling Webpack to resolve our files and modules and things like that. So this is where you typically see rules for what are called loaders. We're going to have only one loader here, and I realize I should probably go and install some things to our package JSON so these things make more sense, but we'll get there in just a moment. So yeah, module is a set of rules, an array of rules rather, that the client configuration is going to follow for dealing with certain types of files, right? So we're going to have an object here. We need to write a test. This is a regular expression. I know jack squat about how to describe how regular expressions work. I typically just Google and Stack Overflow and Reddit or regex 101, my way to victory. But basically, this is a test saying, hey, as we're going through all files in our client folder, find any file that ends in either .ts or tsx. I know that's what the question mark means. It means that x character is an optional test, because we might have some ts files that have some like data inside of them, or just some vanilla functions, or that's where our service files may be. So not everything in my client is going to be a tsx file. So I'm just saying, hey, ts or tsx, I don't care if it matches that pattern in any shape, way, or form. I want you to use the following loader. TS loader. Now we haven't installed that yet, but this is a loader that says, hey, I'm going to follow and use TypeScript compiling rules and things like that, right? We're going to also exclude, I know we have to include this in fairly regularly all over the place. I'm just kind of, there we go, kind of paranoid about it trying to apply some, what's it called? Bundling on node modules. Don't do that. We don't need to do that at all. So we need to make sure it excludes node modules when running through that test. And then we need to provide some options as well. I'm going to say for context. Context is, it's going to tell it where the entry point or folder is going to be for my TS config when I eventually write it here in my client. So I'm going to say, hey, I want you to resolve a path for me of _dir name, so I don't have to reference again. I don't want to have to reference the absolute path in my computer, the full hard drive path to this directory. If y'all clone this, I want to make sure it can work on your machine as well. So we're going to reference the _dir name. That will allow us to be like the root of the project DnD note taker. Even if you clone it to your machine, the _dir name represents the absolute path before this particular directory, which in my case is DnD note taker. And then we're going to say, look for source and client like that. And then we're going to say your config file is going to be called tsconfig.json. That way these options, the tsconfig JSON, will be found by the one in source client and not the global one up here. That's how I can specialize two different other tsconfig files for my both client and server side code when I get there. Cool. So now that that's done, that's probably like the only, eventually I'll probably have to come in here and I will have to add another test and rule, because eventually we're going to have to start talking about how we're going to style our app, and whether that becomes through Bootstrap, something I'm very familiar with, or maybe Tailwind. I'm still debating on what I want to do for styling on this application. That's going to be like probably my weakest area, because I'm like a kid getting a hold of a crayon. I just go crazy. But this is where you would include other rules to say, hey, if I have a CSS or a SCSS, a Sass file, here's how you test for that file extension, and here's how I treat it. So if you've done some basic React work, you've probably seen in like Create React App or Next tutorials that you get to write import my style from my file.css, or just import bootstrap bootstrap.css. Importing a CSS file ain't something you just do in JavaScript. It's actually a rule that is found here in Webpack with some loaders that it will follow the rules on to appropriately handle an import statement like that. So that's something very important to keep in mind. I have a lot of students or even individuals that join our community and ask, and I've seen them say, hey, I had this like custom boilerplate written, or I'm using this like y'all's Covalence's boilerplate for React and Express, and I'm writing an import CSS file, and it's not working, but it worked in Create React App. Why? It's because they had a test and loader written here. Cool. We also need to tell it what extensions it's going to be resolving. Extensions is an array, and it'll be TSX, TS, and JS in case they are mixed in. That way, if you have like some JS code you got to paste in and to get this thing working, it's going to be good to go. And now we got to tell it where it's going to output the compiled and bundled code. The file name will be app.js, so it's going to slap that out as a singular app.js file. And the path to that particular thing will be a path resolve under underscore dir name. Look for the public folder in the root of the project, and specifically make a folder called JS inside of that. So that's where that public JS in our gitignore came from. When we finally compile this thing, it's going to build it and output it right here. That's eventually where it's going to end up going here. Yeah, so that is what our client config ends up looking like, right? So while I'm here, there's nothing I can still write or test yet, but while I'm we'll talk about installs later. Yeah, so again, Webpack, it's a confusing mess, but it's like this industry standard that helps us do what we're doing here, of telling it, what do I do with all my files, all that junk in the trunk right here of the client folder, and where should it be compiled, bundled together, and where do I put the output, and what rules do I follow to get to that process, and do you have any exceptions or custom written code I should know about? That's what this does for me right here, okay? Now I've done the client config, we gotta do the same thing for the server config. So const server config equals curly braces, and let's get going. I'll do the same thing for mode. I'm going to copy and paste this line of code down yonder because the mode is going to be the exact same thing. Our entry point, I'm going to copy and paste this particular line of code as well. Except it's going to be server, and a server.ts file will be the entry point for this particular configuration. Let's go ahead and add our rules for our modules here. How we're going to handle our modules. Rule klasse. On our rules, we're going to have a test. We're going to have obviously no TSX files here, so we need to just test for TS. Yeah, it makes sense to me. Like I said, regex ain't my specialty. There is our test. What's wrong with it? Oh, it needs to be inside of an object in the array. There we go. I knew I was missing something. And then for our loader, same thing. It's going to be using TS loader when we get to that point in time. I want to make sure it excludes node underscore modules, like that. And same thing for options. I need to tell it in the context of where the entry point is for this particular set of files. We're going to say under underscore dir name. It'll be in source server. And when using the TS loader, the config file will be relative to this context, right? So again, the point of this is to make sure that our TS loader, when it begins to compile our TypeScript code from our server, it knows that the context is going to be specifically the server directory inside the source folder, and it will have its own TS config inside of there that it needs to read. Now, what's the problem over here? Why is this all angry at me? Oh, okay, that hopefully should get. This error is telling me that it doesn't know where the input files are, so we'll get there when we get there, because that should be resolved when I actually write the other TS configs and extend them all together. Okay, so I saw the red over here, and of course I'm like red and like error already. I'm like, I barely started. How is there already an error? All right, so that is our set of rules for this server config. I need to tell it the file extensions. We're going to be resolving as an array ts and again .js. Because again, we might have like a library that we're importing that only uses JS and not TS. So I want to make sure that it also knows it can resolve JS files that we happen to import into our project if needed. The output for this particular one will be a file name called server.js, and its path will be that other folder payment method change event. What kind of autocomplete is that? Path.resolve under underscore dir name. And we're going to tell it to build that dist folder, where that's that corresponding production code I was talking about in the gitignore back there. So there's our output. Now, again, because Webpack is meant to be compiling bundling all different kinds of code, I need to really make sure to tell it that, hey, you're dealing with node code here, which will include things like path and file system and other things like that the browser clearly doesn't have. So we got to make sure it knows what target we're meaning here, which is something special about the server config and why I can't just have one singular object config, at least not to my knowledge after what I've been digging through on Webpack's documentation, which is always fun. Okay. This I have written down, just do it. That's for my notes. So thanks late night Luke for not writing down why I have this in here. It says just write it down, lol, for my own notes. That's kind of sad. I'll have to make sure to double check into that to see if I know why that's written the way it is, because that's kind of a funny, that is a goofy way of writing something in there. But yeah, okay, fair enough, Luke. And then yeah, like I was saying, we need to also, so this is something that's nifty right here as well. Like webpack is not going to know that we need all of the node externals, things like file system and path and stuff like that. Like webpack doesn't have that as built into it as a feature. We have to tell it specifically that we need those node externals, right? So to do that, we have to also install something, require it here in this file, and then add it as a function down here in the externals property, right? So in particular, where did I put that note? Yeah, so when bundling Webpack with backend, you usually don't want to bundle its node modules dependencies. The library that we're about to talk about and import here in a moment, or require, creates an externals function that ignores node modules when bundling in Webpack, right? So this is kind of like a plugin for our Webpack that tells it that not bundle all the node underscore module stuff just for our node side server code, okay? So we'll talk about that in just a moment, because now I think it's time we move on to actually installing the stuff I've been talking about, like the node externals and Webpack itself. Obviously, we're going to need here TS loader and a few other things as well. So we're going to head back to our command line over here. We're going to go ahead and npm install a couple things. Obviously, we're going to need eventually Express. We're going to need React. We're going to need React DOM. We're going to need TypeScript. And we're going to need our Webpack. Webpack CLI will allow me to write Webpack shell script commands in my package JSON. We're going to need that Webpack node externals I was talking about as well. I'm going to want TS loader, because that was that loader I was using in the configuration objects we were just writing. Let's go ahead and just get those installing here. And what else do we need? Well, NodeMon, when I run my server, I want to make sure that my server auto refreshes or auto restarts itself every single time I change my server side code. Because if you just run node on a server side file, will just run the previous code until you stop it and restart it. The process of stopping and restarting is very annoying, so I'll be installing NodeMon as a dependency of this project as well. This is running node on a file with auto restart features. So whenever we make changes to our server-side code, I want that server to restart itself automatically. From there, I'm also going to be the types, right? I need the types for Express. I need the types for React. I need the types for React-DOM. There we go. And then finally, this one will make sense when I talk about it here in just a moment, but I'm also be installing a little script, a little npm package called npm run all. This will allow me to run multiple things at once, because I need both Webpack building my website, my React code, and my server code in parallel. NodeMon will handle restarting the server whenever that happens, and I'll have to refresh my browser to view my latest React code. If you're wondering, is there some kind of cool hot module reloading or auto refreshing we could write as a script? Yeah, if you're interested, let me know in the description. We'll talk about that. But that's going to require running two separate servers, whereas in this case I'm running one individual server off of one individual port. So that'll take more setup, and it'll take a split terminal window to have one that actually runs an auto refreshing browser side thing. So keep that in mind. That's the one downside with to do that there. All right, with that stuff installed, we can go back to our other import I was talking about here. We'll call it node externals require Webpack node externals. And like I said, this provides a function for us. So we need to go down here and tell it externals, boom, boom, and bada bing, bada boom. There's our externals. Okay, so we should be, barring a typo, which there's a distinct possibility I made inside of here, we should be done in our configuration for Webpack. Hurry! Oh, no, no, we are not. I just realized my variables are dimmed out. So the Webpack CLI will allow you to specify like config file and how that config file will run which config in which order. So I need to make sure that we export out module.exports an array with our server config and our client config. There we go. That's going to be kind of important, isn't it? This will tell it to build two different configurations. I think we pass an array of objects with their configurations, and Webpack will know to watch those objects and follow those rules, right? So there we go. I knew I forgot something. All right. Like I was saying, it is time to actually maybe move into building out some source code, right? So I'll go ahead and go into my server and build a tsconfig.json. And here is where I will need to tell it we're going to be extends that parent level, right? So we're going to go up two directories and say it's going to extend that mother tsconfig right here. So that's how they can have like that umbrella link between them, and we can have individual types and TypeScript support for server-side code. And again, VS Code does not like two different kinds of TS configs coming from one top level one. So this is actually a little benefit for VS Code inferring what your types are and what kind of code you're writing and what kind of types to expect for server-side code versus client-side code, right? And this is that line that's going to link them all together. Then we're going to have our compiler options. I'll also go ahead and just write my include. We're going to include everything in this directory, so I'll say this directory itself is included for this TS config. And for compiler options, we got to tell it what our output directory is going to be, which will be in the root dist, like that. Our module resolution we're going to be doing here will be common.js. For our target, we're going to do ES5. We're going to write our ES module interop. So ES module interop true, and I think it's allow synthetic default imports true. This is something I like to do on my TypeScript projects, because if you've seen a TypeScript import statement before, it is import asterisk as thing from thing. ES module interop and allow synthetic default imports allows me to simply try and streamline how Node handles its modules, because some projects may be written in vanilla JS that do module.exports. Maybe they're written in TypeScript, or maybe they are written in JS, but they use Babel to transpile their code, so they get to write export statements. Maybe they write export default. Maybe they write export, a named export. So this kind of helps streamline the different ways individuals can write packages and export statements, and tries to streamline them all into an easy to write import statement. So I like to always typically include these as a pair in my TypeScript projects. We need to have a lib, and we'll say include everything like up to ES 2017 or something like that. Yeah, this just adds like certain TypeScript features. So if I write like object.keys or object.values, like maybe like newer methods and newer JavaScript, to make sure it knows that that's a thing I can safely write and do. For our types, we're obviously going to have Node as our types and Express as well. That way that at types express types are included here as well. And our type roots, eventually we're going to have a file that might have some custom interfaces and things like that in it. So I'll tell it to find that in my server types folder should I eventually include that in this project. I'll probably, when we get to authentication especially, or modifying the request object, when we begin adding maybe passport or something to this project, that will be pretty important to have there for our server types here. So yeah, looks pretty good for a TS config. Let's go ahead and build out a new file, our server.ts, the entry point to our server-side code and to our entire server, right? This is where the basis of a lot of our imports are going to be. I'm going to be importing Express from the Express module here to build out our server. I'm going to build a new application by simply invoking Express. This entire library returns to me a pre-configured server application that's quick to add routes to. I need this to be serving my indexed HTML from my public folder as a default request, and that is done via a middleware that's actually built into Express for me called express.static. That right there. And I'm going to provide simply say in the root of the project, I'm not going to do a path.join or anything like that, or path resolve. I just say look in the root of the project for a folder called public, and by default, it will find the indexed HTML file and serve it as a static asset into the browser. I'm also going to be writing a GET request to test something with, we'll call it maybe /status. And we'll have a request and a response, and I just simply want it to send a status code of 200 OK in the event it's good to go. This is just a quick GET request I do on a lot of my servers. I call it a health checkpoint, because sometimes if I'm in production and something is crashing, I'm asking myself, is it a problem with an individual API route, or is it like my entire server is down? So I always like to include a high-level status request to my server to make sure that, well, I can check its healthiness overall, right? So we're going to be testing that right here. But maybe for now, we're going to change this to hello, and maybe just a JSON response of the string world. Again, I'm going to test this in the browser first. So I want to just go to the browser, type /hello, and confirm it sends world. And if I go to localhost :3000, I want to confirm it sends the index HTML when I get there. Okay. Now we're going to have our app listen on a particular port. We're going to pick 3000 by default, and we're going to give ourselves a console log callback function. A callback function that runs a console log that says server is running on this port. So here we go. Server running on port 3000 exclamation point smiley face, winky smiley face, so I know it is indeed running. So there is our basic server-side code. And yeah, that's how we're going to start our server. The tsconfig is linked to the server folder, extending this top level one right here. Should be good to go. And we're going to head to our client-side folder. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and this. Collapse my server folder and open my client folder. We're going to have our whole application being rendered from the index.tsx. I need to make a very simple app.tsx component. I did TS here, right? Yeah, I did. I have this habit of like sometimes defaulting to JS. And I also need to have that tsconfig written here as well for that JSON file. Beautiful stuff, folks. Okie dokie artichoke. Favorite phrase, evidently. In the tsconfig, same thing. I need to make sure it extends the umbrella holder vanilla tsconfig from that top level file. We're going to write my include everything here. And then from there, we'll include my compiler options. So let's go. Why did I do it in this order? I think it's because I put include at the bottom of the other one, so I'm just trying to be consistent, but honestly, their order doesn't matter. Right, so our out directory, it will be, hey, look at root public JS. That'll be where this code is going. Our module, we're going to do ES6. ES6, I don't think it's case sensitive. I'll find out the hard way if it is. Our target is ES5. Our module resolution will be node. I believe that's what I like here. And we're going to do the same thing. What is it again? ES module interop. True, and allow synthetic default imports. True. And this is where we're going to tell it that, hey, we are indeed doing React.jsx. So our TSX files, it knows it's dealing with React code inside of there. So it knows to help us with certain React.jsx features and not tell us, hey, this is not valid JavaScript code. What are you writing here, right? And for libraries, same thing, ES 2015, and we're going to also do DOM because this is going to be running in client-side code. So these libraries are just telling it, hey, TypeScript, just draw upon the knowledge of these libraries to help us write out this code right here as well. So, okay, that should be our tsconfig for our client-side code. Let's go ahead and begin building out my application. I'm going to write import React from React. We're going to write our. I have ES module interop here. What you talking about, Willis? And I know sometimes like it gets goofy when you're trying to. Sometimes VS Code has difficulty picking up like types here. Yes, yeah, close the file and open it again. Now it's happy and good to go. So sometimes these configuration files, when you write them, like full closing VS Code and reopening it, or closing the files and reopening them, and everything starts working again because everything gets linked up and types are all happy again and it's good to go. I find that the classic IT solution of turning it off and on again is the way to go. All right, so let's make our component. I'll say, let's make a type for our props. It's going to be an empty object. We don't have any props being passed in yet. We're going to call this component app. The props it's going to have eventually, if any, will be under type of app props, which right now are none. And then we need to return any amount of JSX for this to be a component. This be an H1 that simply says this is cool. And let's default export this sucker out. There's our beautiful app.tsx. Now that that's set up, we're ready to go into our index. Import React from React so we can write JSX code. Import React DOM from React-DOM/client is how you get the newest and greatest features for React rendering into the DOM, where you can add experimental things such as strict mode and suspense and concurrent rendering and stuff like that. This is the new, I think, V18 and later version of how to do an import React DOM statement. It's no longer just React DOM and React DOM.render. I need to import my app to actually render it in this file from the app file. And here's where I'm going to say, give me a root by running react dom.create root. And here's where we're going to have to write document.querySelector hashtag root or ID root. Where does this come from? This is actually probably a good point to pause momentarily and head to our public index HTML. Use our emit shortcut !enter to generate a pretty solid starting HTML file. We'll call it title DnD note taker. This is where I need to provide that div root. That's where that query selector is going to come from. It's probably a good idea to include a node script. You need JavaScript to see this, there's our root. And this is also where I need to specify that when it comes time to actually compile and bundle our code, that my script source should be JS app.js when we actually end up building this particular project. So there we go. That's how our index HTML is going to be set up. So now hopefully that query selector root makes sense. Like, this is going to be the root div that our entire app is going to render into. As y'all know, React is just div soup at the end of the day. And we're going to say root.render our application in its entirety like that. And that should be all we need to get this sucker going. I'm sure I've forgotten something along the way. I'll find that out when I get there. But for now, let's go ahead and add some scripts to build this stuff out, right? Makes sense to me. All right, we're going to head to our package.json, and we're going to have a couple of scripts here. I want to have a nice simple build script to test stuff with here in a moment, where I'm simply going to tell it to run webpack one singular time to build everything out for me and see if it works, and then we can start the project up and have it auto restarting and stuff like that, right? That's a nice simple script to have right there. In production, how do we start this application? Well, npm run start should simply run node on dist server.js, that compiled code that eventually outputs the server that serves the website and its associated JavaScript bundle. That's going to be how we're going to start our whole project at some point in the future. That's going to be our start script. Now, I'm going to have a dev script here in just a moment, but it's going to make more sense when I write out these two other scripts first. So these are going to be two additional scripts. I'm going to call it watch::build, or maybe watch::client. Well, build makes more sense. And then we're going to have another one called watch::server. Like that. Now, watch::server is going to be running nodemon on dist server.js, because I want, when Webpack compiles and bundles our new server code, again, I want my server to auto restart itself so I don't have to constantly turn it off and back on again to see my changes. I want that to auto restart itself. That's why we're going to say nodemon on that outputted code. Now build, remember, my Webpack config has both the client and server objects inside of it, which means I'm going to pass webpack-w for it to be watching the associated client and server files for changes. So when those changes, meaning I add new files, write new code, save whatever, I want it to be watching all of that stuff. And when anything changes, recompile, rebundle, output the new file, dist server.js or public.js app.js. And when those output, then my server should restart with nodemon, and to see changes in my client-side code, I go to the browser, refresh, and look at my new code changes. So that's where we're going to do that right there. So I want these two things running in parallel, which on Windows, I know there's some weird scripting stuff. I think on Mac, on a traditional like Linux or Mac terminal, you could probably write these in concurrent. But I'm using this little package here called npm run all that says, hey, when I write npm run dev, I want it to actually run npm run all. And I would like you to run two scripts in parallel. That's how you spell it, right? Two L's at the beginning. That sounds right. Parallel. That sounds right. And then I want you to run which scripts? watch : asterisk, that wildcard means watch anything that starts with watch : aka these lines 7 and 8, run those two things in parallel and it should be good to go. So okay, with that, let's does this work? I don't know, let's find out. npm run build. So this is the first time I want it to run. I want it to build everything, and dude, did I just get a clean build? So this is what a webpack output looks like. It just tells you what it ended up bundling and building and outputting here and emitting, and it looks like it ran. So if I wanted to test this, I could go and simply run npm run start to tell it to boot up my server. The server is running. So if we go to the browser and hit up localhost 3000, why did it go to 3001? Why would it default to that one? All right, error. What's the error? So yeah, most browsers are coded to look for a favicon, the little icon you will see in your tabs and bookmarks. I don't have one yet, but because it's such a modern mainstay thing, browsers are automatically coded to look for it. I didn't provide one. We'll talk about that later. That's okay. If you refresh, typically it goes away. No errors. Looks like this is cool from my React component loaded. If I go to /status now, ooh, we got a 404. I didn't call it status, I called it hello. And I got my outputted response of world from the server. So the server endpoint, the get request to /hello is working. The server is serving the correct static React page here, which I'm digging it, right? Super zoomed in there. And I should be able to look at my component tools as well. Yeah, it recognizes app is right there. What's it fussing at me for? Oh, I'm not running strict mode. We'll get there in a separate video. This one's gone long enough already. My goal for this first video was to get everything up and running, and if y'all wanted to go run this code and go rampant with it and figuring out how it works, go for it. We'll add a description here. Tutorial. I can spell. Who said I couldn't? Technically, the main file is definitely going to be the server. So I'll say that's the main particular file here. Keywords, DnD, CRUD app, full stack, React, Express, Node, and MySQL eventually. There we go. Looks good to me. Author, I'll say me as Cool Hand Luke. Eventually, especially if you're all going to be sharing and goofing off with this, I should add a license to be official. We'll add an MIT license eventually when I get there, so we'll do that, and I'll add it in a future update. README, we'll add a quick H1 that just says DnD note taker, and maybe I'll write some stuff here in the future. For now, I just wanted to have some nice plain vanilla text inside of there. Yeah, it looks good. I mean, it ran. Oh, let's test something, right? I'm going to stop the server, because what if I want to test to see if I can make changes? I'm going to write run dev now, and we'll see the output is going to be a little bit different, because remember, it's asking Webpack to build everything and then start my server. So as of right now, a refresh here should work the exact same way. A new tab going to /hello should still output world with no changes. Now, let's change two things. On our server, let's change the response of world to world with a bunch of exclamation points. Save the file. We're going to make sure that Webpack recognize a change was made, because this should be watching my server files. Recognize a change happened. It outputted a new server.js that triggered nodemon to restart. So if I refresh, which will redo this request, boom, that change has been reflected. Let's head to our client-side code and do the same thing to make sure that when I save this file, that Webpack recognized a change occurred, is now recompiling and rebundling my client-side code. So if I refresh the page, it recognizes that the code changed. So our npm run dev script is indeed up and running and good to go. So I'm talking about, y'all. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. I think this is a pretty good start ending point for this part of the video. We've talked about all our configurations, gotten all of our code up and running at its bare bones format. It's outputting stuff. It's looking pretty solid. I think this is a pretty good stopping point. So what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to head to my GitHub real quick on my other monitor. And my horrible notes that I wrote for this video that I mostly followed, my note says, just do it, LOL. We're going to make this a repository. We're going to call it DnD Note Taker. create repository. What am I doing this off camera for? There we go. And we're going to go ahead and push this to my GitHub as well, so y'all can take a look at the links if you want to clone it and do something with it. So here we go. Let's stop it here. And we already have the Git repository done, so we need to add a remote origin. Paste that link. We're going to add everything. So we're going to say, well, let's see, it's recognizing everything here. Yeah, I'm making sure node modules and dist don't appear here because those don't need to be being pushed to GitHub, but everything else should be. So I'll say git add everything, git commit, initial commit, git push. We're going to set the upstream to origin main. There we go. Look like we are pushed and good to go. And that is a fantastic stopping point for this video. Hope you all enjoyed building at the moment it's Hasstack because I haven't done anything with a MySQL database yet, but basically this is like a good template to building a full stack application from complete scratch, which is a pretty cool skill set to know how to do, not gonna lie, right? This is really cool that you could say, yeah, I could build it all from total scratch and I mostly know what I'm writing minus the webpack stuff, aka I'll have the documentation open for it as I go through it, right? I think that's pretty dang solid, y'all. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. This is part 1 of however long this series is gonna go. Like I said, it's meant to be long form, longer tutorial style videos that go over a whole breadth of information as I build my little note-taking app here from complete scratch with you guys following along with me. So hope you enjoyed the long-form video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, check the description below to get involved in the Covalence community. I have my own standalone advanced React course if you guys want to learn React, Redux, UTI, context, suspense, all this cool, crazy React stuff. I have my own course, and we also have a full stack bootcamp if you're following along here and you want to learn how to write all this stuff from total scratch as well with more in-depth help and webinars and things like that, then make sure you sign up for a full stack bootcamp. But ta-ta for now.